You know what they say about frogs in boiling water? How they don't jump out because the temperature rises so gradually they don't notice until it's too late. That's exactly what my wife was counting on when she started her little psychology experiment on me. Except she made one critical miscalculation. I'm not a frog, and I definitely noticed the heat. It started small, like these things always do. Little comments here and there about how I loaded the dishwasher wrong, how I never seemed to do anything right around the house. At first, I figured she was just having a rough patch at work, maybe some stress she needed to work through. So I adjusted, tried to be more helpful, more understanding. Big mistake. The test began about 3 months into what I now realize was a carefully orchestrated campaign. She'd asked me to pick up groceries, then criticize every single item I brought home. Too expensive, wrong brand, not organic enough. When I'd point out that she never specified these requirements, she'd give me this look. You know the one. The look that says I should have just known better. Then came the social experiments. We'd be out with friends, and she'd start these conversations about what makes a real man. How some husbands just don't step up, don't take charge like they should. All while looking directly at me with this smug little smile. Our friends would shift uncomfortably, sensing the tension but not understanding what they were witnessing. The breaking point of that first month came during a dinner party at her sister's house. I was telling a story about something that happened at work, and she cut me off mid-sentence. "Nobody wants to hear about that," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why don't you help clear the table instead of just sitting there?" The room went silent. Her sister looked mortified. Her brother-in-law raised his eyebrows. And me? I stood up, cleared my plate, and didn't say another word for the rest of the evening. But I was taking notes. Mental notes. Every single slight, every public humiliation, every little test she thought she was running. What she didn't realize was that I was studying her just as intently as she was studying me. And I was starting to see a pattern. These weren't random outbursts or stress responses. These were calculated moves, designed to see how much I'd take before I either broke down or fought back. The real confirmation came 3 weeks later. I was upstairs and heard her on the phone with one of her girlfriends. "I'm just testing him, seeing if he's actually got a backbone or if he's going to be one of those pushovers forever. So far, he's failing pretty miserably." That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with a stressed-out spouse. I was dealing with someone who had turned our marriage into her personal laboratory, and I was the lab rat. She was running experiments to see what my breaking point was, how much disrespect I'd tolerate, how far she could push before I'd snap. Well, she was about to find out, but not in the way she expected. The next day, she tried another one of her tests. Left a list of household chores on the kitchen counter with a passive-aggressive note about how some people need written instructions to contribute to the household. Instead of getting defensive or angry, I did something that clearly wasn't in her playbook. I smiled. "Thanks for the list, honey," I said, folding it neatly and putting it in my pocket. "This is really helpful." The confusion on her face was priceless. She'd loaded that list with attitude, expected a reaction, maybe even a fight. Instead, I'd completely deflated her little power play with 2 sentences and a smile. She spent the rest of the day trying to figure out what had gone wrong with her test. That night, she escalated. Started questioning my decisions about everything from what TV show we watched to how I arranged the furniture. Every response was designed to make me feel small, incompetent, like I couldn't do anything right without her guidance. But I'd figured out her game now. And the beautiful thing about knowing you're being tested is that you can choose how to respond to the test. You can play along with their expectations, or you can flip the script entirely. I chose option 2. Instead of defending myself or getting frustrated, I started responding with questions. Why do you think that bothers you so much? What would you prefer instead? Is there something specific you're trying to accomplish here? Each question was delivered calmly, almost clinically, like I was the one studying her behavior instead of the other way around. And it was driving her absolutely crazy. By the end of that week, she was working overtime trying to get a rise out of me. The tests were coming daily now. Little provocations, public embarrassments, situations designed to make me look weak or incompetent. But every time she'd set up one of her psychological experiments, I'd respond in a way that wasn't in her manual. She wanted me to get angry? I stayed calm. She wanted me to defend myself? I asked her questions instead. She wanted me to chase her approval? I stopped caring whether she approved or not. The woman who thought she was testing my breaking point was about to discover that she'd actually been testing something else entirely. My willingness to play her game. And that test, I was about to fail it spectacularly. The second month of her experiment was when she decided to go public with her testing. Apparently, my calm responses at home weren't giving her the data she wanted, so she moved the laboratory to places where there would be witnesses to my supposed failures. First target, the grocery store. She'd suggested we go shopping together, which should have been my first red flag since she usually preferred going alone. We're walking down the cereal aisle when she suddenly stops and announces, loud enough for half the store to hear, "I can't believe you don't know what kind of milk we buy. We've been married for 3 years." The thing was, I knew exactly what kind of milk we bought, but she deliberately pointed to the wrong shelf, waiting to see if I'd correct her and look like a controlling husband, or stay silent and look like an idiot who didn't know his own household. I chose option 3. You're right. I should pay better attention to these details. Which one should I grab? She blinked. That wasn't the script. She wanted either conflict or submission, not polite cooperation that made her look unreasonable for making a scene over milk. The next test came at her company's barbecue the following weekend. She spent the entire afternoon introducing me to her coworkers with these backhanded comments. "This is my husband. He's still figuring out how to be handy around the house. Oh, he tried to fix our sink last week, but we had to call a professional anyway." Each comment was designed to chip away at my credibility, make me look incompetent in front of people I'd just met. Her colleagues were clearly uncomfortable with how she was talking about me, but she was watching my face, waiting for that moment when I'd either snap back at her or shrink into myself with embarrassment. Instead, I started agreeing with her. She's absolutely right. I'm still learning. Luckily, I married someone who keeps me on track. Then I'd turn to whoever we were talking to and ask them about themselves, completely shifting the focus away from her little performance. By the fourth conversation like this, she was getting visibly frustrated. Her tests weren't producing the reactions she'd mapped out. And worse, I was coming across as the reasonable, humble husband while she looked like someone who enjoyed putting her spouse down in public. The third week, she decided to test my masculinity more directly. We were at a restaurant with another couple when the waiter brought the wrong dish to our table. Before I could say anything, she jumped in. "My husband's too polite to send it back. He never wants to make waves, even when he should." She was creating a situation where I'd either have to be aggressive with the waiter to prove her wrong, or stay quiet and confirm her assessment that I was weak. But there was a third option she hadn't considered. I smiled at the waiter. "Actually, this looks great, but I think there might have been a mix-up with the order. Could you double-check what we had written down?" Problem solved. No aggression, no passivity, just straightforward communication. The waiter apologized, fixed the issue, and life moved on. But she spent the rest of dinner trying to create more situations where I'd have to choose between looking weak or looking like a jerk. That's when I realized something important. Her tests weren't really about finding my breaking point. They were about trying to force me into a box where she could control the narrative. Either I was the angry husband she had to manage, or I was the weak husband she had to carry. Both options put her in the position of being the reasonable one, the victim of my inadequacy. But I wasn't playing by her rules anymore. The following Tuesday, she tried her most ambitious public test yet. We were at her book club, which was really just an excuse for 6 women to drink wine and gossip for 2 hours. She'd insisted I come along, claiming she wanted to include me more in her social activities. Halfway through the evening, during a discussion about relationships, she decided to put me on the spot. "I was just telling the girls how you never planned anything romantic anymore. Like, When was the last time you surprised me with something thoughtful? 6 pairs of eyes turned to me, waiting to see how I'd handle being called out in front of her friends. She was expecting me to either get defensive and make excuses or apologize and promise to do better. Both responses would have made me look like either an angry man or a chastened boy. Instead, I took a sip of my wine and said, "You know what? You're absolutely right. I've been taking our relationship for granted lately. Ladies, what are some things your partners do that make you feel appreciated?" For the next 20 minutes, I got a masterclass in romantic gestures from her own friends while she sat there watching her test backfire completely. Not only had I avoided looking defensive or weak, I turned her criticism into an opportunity to actually improve our relationship while making her look petty for bringing it up the way she did. By the time we left that night, I could see the wheels turning in her head. Her testing strategy wasn't working the way she'd planned. Every scenario she'd created to expose my weaknesses was somehow making her look worse instead. That's when she decided to change tactics. If subtle public humiliation wasn't breaking me down, it was time to bring out the bigger guns. She was about to test not just my patience or my masculinity, but my self-respect. And that's where she made her biggest miscalculation yet. Because there's a difference between being patient with someone you love and being a doormat for someone who's actively trying to break you down. I'd been patient for 2 months, studying her methods, learning her patterns, giving her every opportunity to stop this game before it went too far. But patience has limits, and she was about to find mine. Month 3 was when she decided to bring out the nuclear option. Since subtle psychological warfare and public embarrassment hadn't broken me, she was ready to test the one thing she thought would guarantee a reaction: my self-respect as a man. The first shot across the bow came at her cousin's wedding. We were at the reception, and she spent the entire evening flirting with every man except me. Not subtle flirting either. The kind that makes other people uncomfortable and wondering what the hell is wrong with her husband that he's just standing there watching it happen. She'd laugh too loud at their jokes, touch their arms when she talked, lean in close when they spoke, all while glancing over to see if I was getting jealous, angry, or territorial like she expected. When I didn't react the way she wanted, she escalated. During the slow dances, she made a point of dancing with 3 different men while I sat at our table. Each time she'd come back, she'd make comments about how good a dancer they were, how charming, how funny. Waiting for me to stake my claim, demand she stop, show some kind of possessive behavior that would prove I cared enough to fight for her. Instead, I asked her if she was having a good time. "Seems like you're really enjoying the party." "That's great." The confusion on her face was worth the entire uncomfortable evening. She'd engineered a situation designed to make me look weak in front of her entire extended family. But my response made her look like someone whose husband was so secure and trusting that her behavior seemed desperate rather than desirable. 2 weeks later, she tried a different approach: financial emasculation. We were at dinner with her work friends when she started talking about our household finances. I keep telling him he should ask for a raise, but he's too scared to have that conversation with his boss. Some people just aren't aggressive enough when it comes to money. This was a direct attack on my ability to provide, my willingness to fight for what I deserved, my value as a partner. She was testing whether I'd defend my professional competence or let her paint me as financially passive in front of people who barely knew me. But I'd learned her game by now. She's right. I could probably be more assertive about compensation. But honestly, I'm pretty happy with where we are financially. We can afford everything we need and most of what we want. How much more aggressive should I be? I turned her criticism into a question about our actual financial situation, which was perfectly fine, making her complaints sound like greed rather than legitimate concern. Her friends started talking about their own financial pressures, and suddenly she looked like someone who wasn't satisfied with a comfortable life. That weekend, she decided to test my reaction to direct disrespect. We were at a neighborhood barbecue when she started telling a story about how I'd tried to assemble a bookshelf the previous month. But she didn't just tell the story, she performed it. complete with exaggerated impressions of me getting frustrated, throwing the instructions down, eventually giving up. Finally, I had to call my brother to come over and finish it. My husband's many things, but handy isn't one of them. She delivered the punchline while looking right at me, waiting for me to either defend my competence or slink away embarrassed. I started laughing. Not fake laughing, genuinely laughing. She's being generous. I think I used about 40 screws when it only needed 12. That poor bookshelf looked like it was held together by sheer determination and prayer. I'd taken her mockery and made it into a self-deprecating story that showed I could laugh at myself. The other guys started sharing their own home improvement disasters, and what was supposed to be a humiliation turned into male bonding while she stood there wondering how her test had gone sideways again. But the real escalation came the following month. She'd invited her ex-boyfriend to a group outing without telling me beforehand. I walked into the restaurant expecting dinner with two other couples and found myself face-to-face with the guy she'd dated for 3 years before we met. This wasn't coincidence. This was a carefully orchestrated test to see how I'd handle my territory being invaded, my authority being challenged, my woman being claimed by another man's presence. She introduced him to everyone else, but left me hanging, waiting to see if I'd introduce myself or if I'd create an awkward scene. I walked over and extended my hand. I don't think we've met. I'm her husband. Not aggressive, not threatened, just matter of fact. He seemed relieved that I wasn't treating him like competition, and we ended up having a perfectly normal conversation about sports while she watched her drama-filled evening turn into a regular dinner party. After he left, she tried to salvage something from her failed test. Doesn't it bother you that I invited him? Most men would have been upset about that. Should it bother me? He seems like a decent guy. Besides, you married me, not him, so I figure I must be doing something right. That was the moment I saw something shift in her expression. Not confusion this time, but something closer to panic. She was running out of tests, and none of them were breaking me the way she'd planned. If anything, I was getting stronger, more confident, more immune to her psychological games with each failed experiment. She was starting to realize that her testing hadn't revealed my breaking point. It had revealed something much more dangerous to her agenda, that I didn't need her validation to know my worth, didn't need her approval to feel secure, and didn't need to prove my masculinity by reacting to her provocations. But instead of stopping the tests, she decided to go nuclear. If subtle manipulation and public humiliation weren't working, it was time for the kind of test that would force a reaction whether I wanted to give her one or not. She was about to learn the difference between testing someone's patience and testing their respect for themselves. And that lesson was going to cost her everything. The final test came on a Saturday night that she'd been planning for weeks. She'd invited her 3 closest friends over for dinner, along with their husbands. What I didn't know was that she'd spent weeks setting up this evening as the grand finale of her psychological experiment. I found out later that she'd been telling these women about her project for months, how she was testing me, documenting my reactions, trying to figure out if I was husband material or just another weak man who needed constant management. Tonight was supposed to be her public demonstration of my inadequacy. The evening started normally enough. Good food, wine, conversation about work and kids and vacation plans. But I could feel the undercurrent of expectation from her friends. They kept glancing at her, then at me, like they were waiting for a show to start. The setup came during dessert. She'd prepared this elaborate story about how I'd failed to handle a situation with our neighbors the week before. According to her version, they'd been playing music too loud, and instead of confronting them like a man should, I just closed our windows and suggested we watch TV in the bedroom. I mean, what kind of man just hides from conflict like that? Sometimes you have to stand up for your family, you know. She delivered this while looking around the table for agreement from the other wives. But here's what she didn't know. I'd recorded that conversation on my phone the week before because I'd suspected it would become ammunition in one of her tests. The real story was that our elderly neighbor had been playing music to keep himself company after his wife's funeral, and I'd suggested we give him space to grieve instead of complaining about the volume. I could have corrected her story, defended myself, pointed out the truth. That's what she expected, what she wanted. Another opportunity to paint me as either weak for letting her lie about me or aggressive for calling her out in front of guests. Instead, I did something that wasn't in her playbook. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and came back with a bottle of wine. While I was refilling everyone's glasses, I started talking. Not to her, but to our guests. You know, it's interesting that story came up tonight, because I've been thinking a lot lately about the difference between strength and dominance, between being a man and just acting like one. I had everyone's attention now, including hers. She was starting to look nervous. For months, I've been watching someone I love try to prove that I'm weak, testing me, pushing me, creating situations designed to make me fail. And I realized something fascinating about that approach. The room had gone completely silent. Her friends were looking between us, starting to understand that they weren't just dinner guests tonight. They were witnesses. See, when someone spends that much energy trying to break you down, it says nothing about your strength and everything about their insecurity. When someone needs you to be weak to feel powerful, they're telling you exactly who they are. I looked directly at her now. The neighbor story is interesting because it reveals the fundamental difference in how we see strength. You think strength means making noise, demanding compliance, forcing confrontation. I think strength means knowing when to fight and when to show compassion. I pulled out my phone and played the recording. Her real words from that night, talking about how sweet it was that I wanted to give an old widower some grace during his grief instead of bothering him about music volume. The silence in that room was deafening. So here's what I've learned from months of being tested. The person doing the testing isn't the strong one. They're the scared one. They're so afraid of being with someone weak that they spend all their energy trying to prove weakness exists instead of building strength together. I looked around the table at her friends, who were staring at their wine glasses like they wished they could disappear. Ladies, has anyone ever told you how your husbands have failed you today? Has anyone spent the evening cataloging their weaknesses for entertainment? Because I'm curious what that says about the strength of those relationships. The husbands were looking at their wives with new understanding. The wives were looking at my wife like they were seeing her clearly for the first time. Here's the thing about breaking points. Everyone has them. But you know what reveals character? What someone does when they reach that point. Do they break down? Do they lash out? Or do they break free? I stood up and looked at her directly. I've spent 3 months being your laboratory rat, documenting every test, every provocation, every attempt to manufacture weakness where none existed. You wanted to find my breaking point? Congratulations. You found it. I walked to the front closet and pulled out a suitcase I'd packed that morning. The breaking point wasn't my patience with your disrespect. It wasn't my tolerance for public humiliation. It wasn't even my willingness to let you flirt with other men while I watched. My breaking point was realizing that someone who claims to love me has spent months trying to prove I'm not worth loving. The room was frozen. Nobody was breathing. So yes, you broke me. You broke my willingness to participate in this experiment. You broke my interest in proving my worth to someone who's determined not to see it. You broke my belief that we're on the same team. I headed toward the door. Ladies, enjoy your evening. Gentlemen, pay attention to what you just witnessed. Because the woman who tests you isn't the one who believes in you. I looked back at her one final time. The experiment is over. And the results? I'm not the one who failed. The aftermath of that dinner party was exactly what you'd expect when someone's carefully constructed facade crumbles in front of their closest friends. She spent the next week in full damage control mode, calling everyone who'd been there, trying to spin what had happened into something she could live with. According to the version she was selling, I'd had some kind of breakdown. The stress of work, maybe a midlife crisis, definitely an overreaction to what she called normal relationship discussions. She painted herself as the concerned wife dealing with an unstable husband who'd embarrassed her in front of their friends. But here's the thing about truth. Once it's out there, it's hard to stuff back in the box. And those people had heard her own recorded words contradicting her public story. They'd watched her face when I called out exactly what she'd been doing. They'd seen her sit in silence when I asked them to examine their own relationships. By Tuesday, one of her friends called me directly. Apparently, after thinking about what I'd said, she'd started noticing similar patterns in her own marriage. Her husband had been making subtle digs about her cooking, her appearance, her intelligence. Little tests disguised as jokes or observations. She wanted to know how I'd figured out what was happening. That conversation led to another, then another. By the end of the week, I'd heard from both husbands who'd been at that dinner. Turns out, when you give men permission to notice manipulation, they start seeing it everywhere. Meanwhile, she was getting increasingly desperate to regain control of the narrative. She tried the guilt approach first. How could I humiliate her like that in front of her friends? Didn't I care about our marriage? Wasn't I willing to work on our problems like adults? When guilt didn't work, she switched to anger. I was being dramatic, oversensitive, unable to handle normal relationship challenges. According to her, every couple goes through phases where they test each other's commitment. I was just too weak to handle the process. That's when I pulled out the folder. See, while she'd been running her experiments on me, I'd been conducting a little research of my own. 3 months of documented incidents. Dates, times, witnesses present. Screenshots of text messages where she discussed her project with friends. Photos of the notes she'd left around the house. Even that recording of her phone conversation where she'd admitted to testing me. You want to talk about our problems? I said, spreading the documentation across the kitchen table. Let's talk about them. But let's use facts instead of gaslighting. For the first time in months, she was speechless. All her manipulation tactics, her revisionist history, her attempts to make me question my own memory and judgment, laid out in black and white. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. This isn't normal relationship behavior, I continued. This is psychological abuse. And the fact that you're trying to convince me it's normal proves you know exactly what you've been doing. She tried one last desperate play. Tears. Apologies. Claims that she'd only been testing me because she loved me so much, because she wanted to make sure we were strong enough to last. She'd made mistakes, but couldn't we work through this together? But I learned something important over the past 3 months. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And she'd shown me someone who thought love meant breaking down the person you claimed to care about, then rebuilding them according to your specifications. Here's what's going to happen, I said calmly. You're going to stop pretending this was about strengthening our relationship. You're going to acknowledge that you spent months trying to systematically destroy my confidence and self-respect. And then you're going to decide whether you want to be married to someone you respect or whether you need someone you can control. The choice was hers, but the testing was over. The final chapter of her testing experiment came 3 weeks later. She'd gone through all the stages: denial, anger, bargaining, and finally what looked like acceptance. She acknowledged what she'd done, admitted it was wrong, and promised to change. But I'd learned something crucial during those months of psychological warfare. Real change takes time to prove, and promises are just words until they're backed by consistent action. So I gave her a test of my own. You want to save this marriage? Here's your chance. But this time, I'm setting the parameters. I laid out my conditions clearly. First, you're going to call every person who was at that dinner party and apologize for involving them in your manipulation game. Not for embarrassing yourself, but for using them as audience members in your psychological experiment. She started to protest, but I wasn't finished. Second, you're going to see a therapist. Not couples therapy, where you can split blame 50-50. Individual therapy to figure out why you thought breaking down someone you claimed to love was acceptable behavior. The look on her face told me she was already calculating whether she could go through the motions without actually changing anything fundamental about herself. And third, You're going to explain to me what you've learned from your months of testing. Not what you think I want to hear, but what you actually discovered about yourself in the process. That last question was the real test. Because after months of focusing on my breaking point, she'd never stopped to examine her own behavior or motivations. She'd been so busy trying to prove I was weak that she'd never asked herself what kind of person needs to tear down their partner to feel secure. Her answer was everything I needed to know. I learned that you're stronger than I thought you were, that you don't break easily, and maybe that's a good thing. She was still making it about me, about my reactions to her tests, rather than examining why she'd felt compelled to test me in the first place. That's when I knew the marriage was over. You still don't get it, I said quietly. This was never about whether I'm strong or weak. It was about whether you're the kind of person who builds up their partner or tears them down. And after 3 months of systematic psychological abuse, you're sitting here telling me you learned I'm stronger than expected. I stood up from the kitchen table where we'd had this final conversation. The experiment revealed exactly what I thought it would. Not my breaking point, but your character. And your character is someone who thinks love includes the right to psychologically torture the person you're with. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized. She tried to frame it as my inability to handle a strong woman who challenged me to be better. But word had gotten around about what really happened. The couples who'd witnessed that dinner party had talked. Her own friends had started recognizing similar patterns in their relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her tests had been designed to prove I was weak, unsuitable, not man enough for her standards. Instead, they'd proven that I was strong enough to recognize manipulation, confident enough to expose it publicly, and secure enough to walk away from someone who thought love meant breaking you down to build yourself up. 6 months after the divorce, I ran into one of her friends at the grocery store. Turns out, 2 of the couples from that dinner party had separated. The women had started testing their husbands more aggressively, and the men had started recognizing it for what it was. You opened a lot of eyes that night, she told me. Made people realize that just because something is common doesn't mean it's healthy. She was right. My wife had spent months testing my breaking point, convinced that everyone had one, that everyone could be broken down with enough pressure and manipulation. She was wrong about one thing, though. I did have a breaking point. It just wasn't where she thought it was. My breaking point wasn't my tolerance for disrespect or my patience with psychological games. My breaking point was my willingness to stay with someone who thought breaking me was a form of love.
Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.